51 years ago, the Galactic Concord's judiciary fleet had escorted 11 billion human beings to a dead pocket of space called the Ashvale Reach, and told them, in the flat, bureaucratic language of a species that had never once doubted its own righteousness, that humanity's capacity for violence made it unfit for membership among the stars. They had not called it exile. The official term, recorded in the Concord judiciary's ruling and broadcast to every member world in the Assembly, was containment for the preservation of galactic order, a phrase that Fleet Admiral Torrin Solis had heard exactly once, on the day his grandmother told him the story as a boy, and had never forgotten, because it was the kind of phrase that tried very hard to disguise a death sentence as a mercy. The Ashvale Reach was not, strictly speaking, a place a species was meant to survive in. It was a scattered debris field of failed star systems on the trailing edge of a spiral arm, gutted by some ancient cataclysm that had left half its worlds tidally locked to dying stars and the other half drifting rogue through permanent dark. No habitable zones, no rich mineral belts, nothing that any sane empire would have fought over, which was precisely why the Concord had chosen it. You did not need walls to cage a species you had already sentenced to a slow, quiet extinction. You only needed to leave them somewhere the universe itself would do the killing for you, and then you needed to stop watching, because watching would mean acknowledging what you had done. The first decade had been the worst of it. According to the oral histories the Reach's surviving elders still told, passed hand to hand because the judiciary fleet had stripped the exile convoy of every piece of long-range communication technology before releasing them into the debris field, on the official reasoning that a contained species had no legitimate use for equipment capable of reaching beyond its containment. 11 billion humans, crammed into a convoy of transport vessels never designed for permanent habitation, had been given exactly one habitable rock, a tidally locked world the survivors would come to call Anvil for the way its sunward hemisphere baked and its darkward hemisphere froze, and told in the same flat bureaucratic language that had described their exile as a preservation of galactic order, that the Concord's obligations toward them were now fully discharged. There had been no follow-up shipments of equipment, no medical support, no acknowledgement in any Concord record humanity would encounter again for 51 years, that 11 billion sentient beings had been left to build a civilization from the wreckage of transport hulls, and whatever raw ore they could strip from a debris field that had never been surveyed for habitability, because no one had ever expected anyone to need it to be habitable. The first winter on Anvil's twilight terminator, the narrow habitable band between the baked and frozen hemispheres, had killed 900 million people to exposure and starvation before the first crude terraforming grids came online. And the survivors of that winter had raised children who grew up understanding, in a way no conquered citizen ever needed to, that mercy was not a force of nature, and that the universe did not owe a debt to anyone's survival. That survival was a thing you built with your own hands out of whatever scrap you were given, or you simply did not survive. Humanity had not died quietly. It had taken 51 years, and it had cost, by the most conservative estimates in the surviving historical archives, nearly 2 out of every 5 humans who had made the crossing into the Reach, but it had not died, and on the morning that this story begins, Fleet Admiral Torrin Solis stood on the command deck of the dreadnought Long Memory, watching a Concord scout vessel limp into the gravity well of a system his people now called Anvil, broadcasting a distress signal in the old Concord diplomatic cipher that humanity's cryptographic archives still remembered, 51 years later, because forgetting had never been something the exiled could afford. "They're hailing us, Admiral," said Lieutenant Commander Priya Osai Vantal, the Long Memory's communications officer, a woman in her 30s who had been born in the Reach, who had never seen the stars the Concord called home, and who nonetheless kept in a locked drawer beside her console a physical photograph of a world she had never visited, printed from an archive file because her mother had told her that a person who forgot where they came from forgot what had been done to them. And forgetting what had been done to you was how empires got away with doing it twice. "Let them hail," Torrin said. He was 58 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades doing manual labor and combat drills in equal measure, because the Reach had never given anyone the luxury of special. Eyesing in only one, his hair steel gray, a scar running from his left temple to his jaw from a mining accident during the long winter, the 23rd year of the Exile, when a third of the Reach's surviving population had nearly starved because the terraforming grids on 3 colony worlds failed within the same brutal season. I want full sensor sweep on that ship before we answer a single word. If this is the opening move of a second containment order, I want to know it before they know we know it. The sensor sweep took 4 minutes, and what it returned made the command deck go very quiet. The Concord scout vessel, according to every metric human sensor technology could measure, was alone. No battle fleet lurking at the system's edge. No Judiciary Fleet capital ships waiting in the dark to finish what the original containment order had started. Just one battered, unarmed scout vessel, its hull scarred with the specific, chaotic damage pattern of something that had been running from a fight rather than starting one. Its drive trailing the telltale radiation signature of an engine pushed well past any rated safety margin for weeks on end. "They're not here to finish us," said Commander Yusuf Achterberg de Lacroix, Torin's second-in-command, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel who had lost his entire birth family in the long winter and had in the 3 decades since built himself a new one out of the crew he'd served alongside, the way most people in the Reach eventually did. "Look at that hull, Admiral. That ship's been in a real fight and it lost. Whatever's chasing it, it isn't us." "Then why come here?" Torin said, not really a question. The Concord spent 51 years pretending this system didn't exist. Their charts still mark the whole Reach as an empty debris field, no habitable worlds, nothing worth a survey mission. A scout ship running for its life from something doesn't stumble into a dead zone by accident. It comes here because someone in the Concord finally admitted, in whatever desperate briefing sent this ship running, that the debris field they exiled us into might actually have something alive in it. Priya's console chimed with the incoming hail resolving into an actual voice, translated by the archaic diplomatic cipher humanity's linguists had kept alive across 5 decades for exactly this eventuality. A voice that carried the particular strain of someone who had not slept in longer than was safe, and who had run out entirely of better options. "This is Envoy Pilot Kessa Vanorith of the Concord Diplomatic Vanguard, requesting immediate parley with any surviving human authority in this system. I am carrying communications on behalf of the Concord Assembly Council. I am not a military vessel. I am not armed beyond minimal point offense. I need you to hear what I have to say before you decide whether to kill me for it." Torin looked at the tactical display, at the single battered scout ship drifting at the edge of weapons range, and felt the specific cold clarity that had carried him through 4 decades of a life the Concord had assumed would end in quiet starvation rather than a fleet command. "Bring her in," he said. "Full escort, and Priya record everything." If the Concord is desperate enough to come crawling back to the species they left to die, I want every word of it on file, because whatever they're about to ask us for, our children are going to want to know exactly how it was asked. Envoy Pilot Kessa Vanorith was escorted aboard the long memory 2 hours later, and Torin met her personally in the ship's cramped conference chamber, flanked by Achterberg de Lacroix and a security detail of 6 armed Marines who made no effort to disguise the fact that they considered every Concord representative diplomatic credentials or not. A potential extension of the same Judiciary Fleet that had abandoned 11 billion humans to die in a debris field. The Marines themselves were young, most of them born in the Reach's 2nd and 3rd decades, raised on stories of the containment order that had taken on, in the retelling across 2 generations, the particular mythic weight of a founding injury, the wound that explained every hardship the Reach's children had grown up enduring. And Torin watched them watch Kessa with an expression that was not quite hatred but was not far from it either, the specific wary hostility of people meeting. For the first time in living memory, An actual representative of the civilization, their grandparents' stories held responsible for 900 million frozen and starved bodies in the first winter alone. Kessa was a tall, willowy being of the Threndel species, pale gray skin mottled with the darker patches that Threndel biology used to regulate temperature. Her eyes a deep, unsettling violet that widened very slightly when she saw the interior of a human warship for the first time, taking in the improvised armor plating salvaged from decommissioned mining vessels. The weapons mounts jury-rigged from tech that predated the containment order by decades. The specific brutal efficiency of a species that had built its entire military doctrine from scrap and desperation rather than institutional wealth. "You've built a fleet," she said, and there was something in her voice that Torin, after 4 decades of listening to every tone a desperate person's voice could carry, recognized immediately as fear trying very hard to disguise itself as professional composure. The Concord's last survey of this sector, conducted 11 years after the containment order, found no evidence of surviving human infrastructure. "We assumed." "You assumed we died," Torin said. "That's what the survey was for, wasn't it? Not to check on us. To confirm we were gone, so the Concord Assembly could file the containment order as a successfully resolved matter and stop thinking about the 11 billion people you sentenced to a slow death in a debris field with no habitable worlds. Am I close, Envoy Pilot?" Kessa did not flinch, which Torin gave her credit for, though he suspected the composure was costing her considerably. "I was not born when the containment order was issued, Admiral. I did not vote for it. I did not enforce it. I am aware that this does not absolve me or my species or the Concord as an institution of what was done here, and I am not here to ask for that absolution. I am here because the Concord Assembly is facing an extinction-level threat, and in the desperate audit of every possible resource that might survive it, someone in the Judiciary Archive finally asked the question no one had asked in 51 years. What if the humans lived? The conference chamber went very quiet, the specific quiet of people confronting a moment they had spent decades imagining and never quite believing would arrive. "And tell us," Torin said. The threat, as Kessa explained it over the following 3 hours, in a briefing that grew more desperate and more detailed, as she seemed to realize that this room of hard-eyed, scarred human officers was not going to simply execute her for the crimes of an institution she had personally had no hand in, was a species the Concord's own xenobiology archives had designated the Threnathi Vor, a hive collective intelligence that had emerged from the galactic core roughly 9 years ago and had in that time consumed or subjugated 41 member worlds of the Concord Assembly. Its expansion pattern unlike anything the Concord centuries of largely peaceful, honor-bound diplomatic and military doctrine had ever encountered. Total indiscriminate consumption of every resource, biological and material, on every world it touched. No interest in negotiation, no capacity for the kind of proportionate, honor-bound warfare that had governed Concord military doctrine for the better part of 2 millennia. An adversary that simply expanded relentlessly, consuming everything in its path with the patient, mindless hunger of something closer to a natural disaster than a rational actor. "Our fleets cannot stop them," Kessa said, and the exhaustion in her voice had stopped pretending to be professional composure somewhere around the second hour. "We have fought them in 17 major engagements over the past 3 years, and we have lost every single one, not because our ships are inferior, but because conquered military doctrine has no framework for fighting an enemy that does not value its own survival in any way our strategic models can predict. That does not negotiate. That does not observe any of the honorable conventions of proportionate engagement that have governed every war the conquered has fought for the past 2,000 years. Our commanders keep waiting for the Threnathi Vor to behave like a rational adversary, to sue for peace when the cost of continued expansion becomes unsustainable, to respond to overwhelming force with capitulation the way every previous adversary the conquered has ever faced eventually has. And they do not because they cannot. Because there is no concept of an acceptable cost in whatever passes for their collective consciousness. We are losing this war, Admiral Ape Solis, and 3 months ago, in a closed session of the Assembly Council that I was not meant to have access to but obtained regardless, one of our senior strategists raised your species. Because we're the only ones in Concord history the Concord itself decided were too dangerous to keep around, Achterberg Delacroix said, his voice carrying a flat, bitter edge. 51 years ago you told the whole assembly that humans were a uniquely violent species, too unpredictable, too willing to escalate beyond proportionate response, unfit for civilized company. And now that you're facing something that actually is uniquely violent and unpredictable and beyond proportionate response, you've remembered that maybe the species you exiled for being too go. Thought at fighting dirty might be useful after all. Kessa's violet eyes closed briefly, and when she opened them there was something in her expression that Torin recognized with a small cold shock as genuine shame. Yes, Commander, that is exactly what happened, and I will not insult this room by pretending otherwise. The Concord Assembly spent 51 years believing it had solved the problem of humanity by removing you from consideration entirely. It has spent the last 3 months, in increasing desperation, coming to the conclusion that the very qualities it once condemned as unfit for civilized company might be the only qualities capable of stopping an extinction-level threat that civilized company has proven catastrophically unable to counter. I am not here to apologize on behalf of an assembly that has not authorized me to apologize for anything. I am here because 41 worlds have already been consumed, because Conquered Intelligence estimates the Threnathi Vor will reach the Assembly's core systems within 18 months at current expansion rates, and because I have concluded, on my own authority and at considerable personal risk in even bringing you this message, that a species which survived 51 years of deliberate abandonment in a debris field the Concord's own charts still list as uninhabitable might be the only remaining chance billions of other beings have of surviving what is coming. Torin sat with this for a long moment, looking at the woman across the table, at the exhaustion carved into her face, at the specific desperation of a diplomat who had gambled her career, and possibly her life on the hope that the species her government had sentenced to death might choose mercy over the perfectly justified alternative of simply letting the conquered reap exactly what it had sown. "Show us the engagement data," he said finally. "Every battle you've lost, every tactic the Threnathi Vor has used. I want to understand exactly what kind of monster your honor-bound doctrine has proven incapable of fighting before I decide whether my people are willing to bleed for a conquered that left us to die." The engagement data, reviewed over the following 2 days by every ranking officer in the human fleet's command structure, painted a picture that even Torin, who had spent 4 decades fighting a debris field that killed with cold indifference rather than malice, found genuinely unsettling. The Threnathi Vor fought like weather. Their vessels, grown rather than constructed from some biological-mechanical hybrid process, the conquered xenobiologists had only partially reverse-engineered, expanded and split and recombined in combat with no discernible command hierarchy, no flagship whose destruction might collapse the formation, no negotiable leadership whose capture or death might end an engagement. They did not retreat when losing. They did not press an advantage when winning, beyond the singular, patient objective of consuming whatever biological or material resource lay in their path. Conquered fleets built across 2 millennia of doctrine that assumed every adversary was a rational actor capable of calculating acceptable cost, had thrown themselves against this incomprehensible hunger 17 times, using tactics of proportionate escalation, honorable engagement, careful de-escalation when losses mounted past acceptable thresholds, and had lost every single time because the Threnathi Vor recognized no threshold, calculated no acceptable cost, and simply continued consuming for as long as biological material remained to consume. They're not fighting a war, said Dr. Amara Osai Kessler, the Long Memory's chief tactical analyst, a woman who had lost her right arm to a reactor accident during the Reach's brutal first decade and had replaced it with a prosthetic built from salvaged mining equipment that whined faintly when she gestured. A war implies two sides making decisions about acceptable cost. This is a wildfire that happens to occupy warships instead of forest. The Concord's entire military doctrine is built to fight decision makers. They have no framework for fighting a process. We do, Torrens said quietly, and every head in the briefing room turned toward him. The Reach didn't ask us to negotiate with it either. It didn't care what we thought was an acceptable cost. It just took people year after year, cold and radiation and crop failure and reactor accidents, and the only thing that ever slowed it down was when we stopped thinking about acceptable cost entirely and started thinking about survival as the only variable that mattered. We didn't beat the Reach by finding a threshold where the dying became too expensive to continue. We beat it by refusing to stop, regardless of what it cost, until there was nothing left of the threat to refuse against. That's the same fight, Doctor, different monster, same math. The human fleet that departed the Ashvale Reach, 11 days later number. D-230 vessels, the largest single deployment humanity had mounted since the exile began, drawn from every shipyard the Reach's scattered colonies could muster, crewed by a generation that had never known anything but hardship, and had in the crucible of that hardship built a military culture that made the old Concord doctrine of proportionate, honor-bound engagement look, to human eyes, like a philosophy designed by people who had never actually needed to survive anything. Torren commanded from the Long Memory, with Kessa Van Orith aboard as liaison, a role she had accepted with the specific, quiet desperation of someone whose own career and possibly life depended on this gamble succeeding. And behind them, a Concord relief fleet of 400 vessels under the joint command structure that the Assembly Council had, in its desperation, finally agreed to subordinate to human tactical authority for the duration of the engagement. An unprecedented concession from an institution that had spent 2 millennia assuming its own doctrine was the only legitimate framework for civilized warfare. The first engagement came at the fallen world of Ostren Prime, a former conquered agricultural colony of 9 million souls that Threnathi Vor forces had begun consuming 6 days prior. Its surface already 3/4 stripped of biological material by the time the combined human-conquered fleet arrived in system. The planet's remaining atmosphere hazed with the specific gray-brown particulate that conquered xenobiologists had identified as the byproduct of the Threnathi Vor's consumption process. A sight that made even veteran human officers, hardened by 4 decades of the Reach's cold indifference, go quiet with a horror that had nothing abstract about it. Concord doctrine calls for immediate evacuation of remaining civilian population and defensive engagement to cover the evacuation, Kessa said, standing beside Torren on the Long Memory's command deck, her voice carrying the flat recitation of protocol she no longer fully believed in. 17 previous engagements followed exactly this doctrine. 17 previous engagements failed to save more than a fraction of the population in question. Because Threnathi Vor consumption proceeds faster than any evacuation logistics, the Concord has been able to execute. And because defensive engagement against an enemy with no exploitable command structure simply delays the consumption rather than preventing it. Then we're not doing defensive engagement, Torren said. Uchterberg, bring up the orbital bombardment plan we drafted on the crossing. Uchterberg Delacroix pulled up the plan on the command deck's central display. And for a moment nobody spoke, the specific silence of officers looking at a proposal that even they, hardened by 4 decades of the Reach's cold indifference, had drafted during the 11-day transit with a kind of grim, unspoken hope that it would never actually need to be used. The plan, which Kessa had reviewed 3 times during the 11-day transit, and had each time gone very still and very quiet in the specific way of a diplomat confronting a proposal that violated every principle of proportionate warfare her culture had ever taught her, called for a coordinated kinetic bombardment of Ostren Prime's surface, targeting not the Threnathi Vor forces directly, but the biological substrate the consumption process required to sustain itself. A scorched earth strike that would render the remaining three-quarters of the planet's surface as thoroughly stripped and lifeless as the quarter the Threnathi Vor had already consumed, denying the enemy any further biological material to feed on while simultaneously killing, in the bombardment itself, whatever fraction of the 9 million original colonists had not yet been evacuated or consumed. There are still an estimated 2 million civilians on that surface, Admiral, Kessa said, and her voice, for the first time since Torin had met her, carried something that was not composure at all. Concord evacuation logistics estimate we could extract perhaps 400,000 of them before the Threnathi Vor consumption front reaches their positions. Your bombardment plan kills the other 1.6 million directly, rather than allowing them to be consumed by the enemy. Would you rather they die being eaten, Torin said, and his voice carried no cruelty, only the flat, exhausted arithmetic of a man who had made this calculation in smaller forms 100 times across 4 decades in the Reach, or die quickly in a bombardment that also denies the Threnathi Vor the biological mass it needs to keep expanding toward the next 9 million civilians on the next world in its path. I am not asking you to like this math, Envoy Pilot. I am asking you to recognize that your Concord's 17 previous engagements, fought with every ounce of your honorable, proportionate doctrine, resulted in every single one of those worlds being fully consumed anyway, at greater total cost in lives, because your doctrine refused to make the hard cut early enough to stop the bleeding. We are not here to save every life on Ostren Prime. We are here to save every life on the 40-something world still standing between here and the Concord's core systems, and that requires accepting a monstrous cost today to prevent a genocidal one tomorrow. That is the fight you asked us to bring, Envoy Pilot. I am bringing it. The bombardment of Ostren Prime proceeded 4 hours later. 230 human warships and the 400 vessels of the Concord Relief Fleet, now formally subordinated to human tactical command, executing a coordinated kinetic strike that reduced the planet's remaining habitable surface to the same lifeless, gray-brown wasteland the Threnathi Vor's own consumption had already created across the opposite hemisphere. On the Long Memories command deck, the strike unfolded across 4 hours of grinding, methodical violence that bore no resemblance to the clean, decisive engagements Kessa Van Orith had studied in Concord military academies, where honorable fleets traded volleys at range, and the side with superior tactics or technology eventually forced an honorable capitulation. This was closer to industrial demolition than battle. Wave after wave of kinetic penetrator rounds, mass-driven from orbit, screaming down through Ostren Prime's thinning atmosphere to strike the biological substrate the Threnathi Vor consumption front depended on, each impact throwing up a column of vaporized soil and organic matter that the ship's optical sensors rendered, at magnification, as a slow-motion bloom of gray fire over and over across a continent's worth of farmland and forest, and the scattered, burning ruins of towns that had 6 days earlier been home to families going about ordinary lives. Human ships took losses even in this one-sided slaughter, because the Threnathi Vor's biological mechanical vessels, deprived of their expansion but not yet destroyed, rose to contest the bombardment with a ferocity that made clear this was not a passive, mindless organism, but something that fought back with genuine and immediate violence when its feeding was interrupted. The corvette Ashvale's Daughter took a direct strike from what Concord xenobiologists would later classify as a bioorganic energy discharge, a weapon grown rather than manufactured, that burned through the ship's salvaged armor plating and cooked 41 crew members alive in their stations before the ship's own point defense batteries, manned by crew who kept firing through decompression alarms and dying comrades, finally brought the attacking vessel down in a tumbling wreck of scorched biomass and shattered hull. Torin watched the loss report scroll across his console with the same flat, unhurried patience that had carried him through 4 decades of losses in the Reach, and gave the order to press the bombardment rather than divert ships to cover the wounded corvette's retreat, because he had learned in the debris field that raised him that the ships you spent trying to save the dying sometimes cost you the living, and the math, however monstrous, did not change simply because it hurt to hold it. By the fourth hour, sensor returns confirmed what conquered xenobiologists aboard the relief fleet had not dared hope for after 17 previous failed engagements. The Threnathi Vor presence on Austren Prime's surface, deprived of fresh biological substrate, had begun to visibly starve, its remaining forces contracting toward a shrinking perimeter of still consumable material with the slow, mechanical desperation of something that had, for the first time in this war, encountered a limit it could not simply expand past. "It's working," Achterberg Delacroix said, watching the sensor returns with the specific grim satisfaction of a man who had spent 4 decades learning to find satisfaction in survival rather than in anything resembling clean victory. "God help us, Admiral, it's actually working." It kept working over the following 4 months, across 11 more contested worlds, as the combined human-conquered fleet under Torin's tactical command applied the same brutal calculus again and again. Strip the biological substrate before the Threnathi Vor could consume it, accept horrific civilian casualties in the near term to deny the enemy the fuel it needed to keep expanding, and use the resulting contraction of enemy forces to press an advantage that 17 previous conquered engagements, bound by a doctrine that had never once considered scorched earth tactics against their own population as an acceptable option, had never been able to achieve. Each of those 11 worlds carried its own grinding, specific horror, details that would fill the after-action reports Torin's staff compiled with the same clinical, unflinching thoroughness the Reach had trained into every surviving officer. The world of Kessendrin Minor, where evacuation logistics failed catastrophically in the planet's northern hemisphere and 11 transport vessels loaded with fleeing civilians were caught and consumed by a Threnathi Vor swarm before the bombardment order could be given. A loss Torin absorbed into the war's growing ledger without visible reaction. Because visible reaction was a luxury a commanding officer bleeding 200 ships across a dozen engagements could not afford his crew to see. The world of Threll's Anchor, where a conquered battle group under joint command broke formation during the critical bombardment window, its captain unable to bring himself to fire on his own species colony despite 3 separate direct orders, a hesitation that cost the combined fleet an additional 40,000 civilian lives, when the delayed strike allowed the Threnathi Vor consumption front to expand into a previously untouched agricultural basin before the bombardment finally proceeded. And the world of Ashvale Reach, named by its long-dead colonists after a conquered world with no relation to the debris field humanity had been exiled into, where Torin's own tactical staff, reviewing casualty projections 40 minutes before a scheduled strike, discovered a miscalculation that would have killed an additional 600,000 civilians beyond necessity, and scrubbed the strike window by 11 minutes to allow one final evacuation convoy to clear the blast radius. A decision that Torin would cite, in the rare moments afterward when subordinates asked him how he lived with the mathematics of this war, as proof that the arithmetic of total war did not require abandoning every scrap of mercy, only refusing to let mercy become an excuse for losing. Human casualties mounted with every engagement, ships lost to the sheer, indiscriminate mass of Threnathi Vor forces that, whatever their strategic incoherence, remained ferociously dangerous in direct combat. But for every human ship lost, the combined fleet's brutal new doctrine brought a measurable, verifiable contraction of the enemy's total expansion. A slow, grinding reversal of a war the conquered had been unambiguously losing for 3 years before the exiled species it had sentenced to death arrived to fight it their way. The worst single loss of that 4-month campaign came at the 9th contested world, a conquered shipbuilding colony called Vantry's Forge, that the Threnathi Vor swarm reached faster than the combined fleet's intelligence estimates had projected, forcing Torin to commit ships to the bombardment window before the evacuation convoys had finished clearing the planet's northern industrial cities. The dreadnought Anvil's Legacy, one of the Reach's oldest and most heavily reinforced vessels, took the brunt of the Threnathi Vor's counterattack when the swarm, sensing the coming strike, redirected its full biological mass against the human fleet's forward line rather than continuing its passive consumption of the colony below. A tactical shift that Concord xenobiologists would later cite as the first documented instance of anything resembling adaptive behavior in 3 years of study. And a shift that cost the Anvil's Legacy both its primary and secondary shield generators within the first 90 seconds of contact. Captain Devrin Osei Marchetti, who had commanded the vessel since the second year of the campaign, watched his own tactical display fill with cascading system failures, hull breaches spreading aft to forward faster than his damage control teams could seal them, atmosphere venting in glittering plumes from a dozen ruptures along the ship's dorsal spine, and made the call 31 seconds before the ship's reactor containment finally failed entirely. To keep the Anvil's Legacy in position rather than break formation and retreat, because the ship's continued presence in the line was buying the evacuation convoys below the final 11 minutes they needed to clear the blast radius before the bombardment could proceed. The Anvil's Legacy died with 840 crew still aboard, most of them still at their stations, still fighting a losing battle against a hull that was coming apart around them, and the ship's final transmission, relayed to the long memory in the last seconds before the reactor breach vaporized the vessel entirely, was Captain Osei Marchetti's voice, flat and unhurried in a way that Torin would recognize listening to the recording afterward. As the exact same tone he used himself when the mathematics required something unbearable. Convoys clear in 90 seconds. Hold the line until then. That's the job. Torin authorized the bombardment 11 minutes later, precisely on the window Captain Osei Marchetti's sacrifice had purchased, and stood afterward, alone in his quarters, with the ship's final transmission looping on his console for longer than he would ever admit to any subordinate, because he had learned across 4 decades in the Reach that a commander who could not sit with the specific weight of every name on his casualty list was a commander who would eventually stop counting them carefully enough. And the counting, however much it cost him personally, was the last remaining tether between the mathematics of total war and the fact that every number in that mathematics had once been a person who deserved to be remembered as more than a variable. The war's grinding arithmetic continued in this fashion for months, worlds saved and worlds partially lost, ships and crews spent against a threat that adapted, however slowly, to the tactics being used against it, forcing Torin's staff to continuously refine their doctrine, tightening evacuation windows, developing faster bombardment sequencing, training conquered crews serving under joint command to execute strikes with the same unhesitating speed that human crews. Raised in the Reach's brutal school, brought to every engagement without needing to be told twice. By the campaign's 10th month, conquered officers who had begun the war regarding their human counterparts with a kind of horrified fascination had, in many cases, absorbed enough of that same unhesitating clarity themselves that Assembly Council observers monitoring the Joint Fleet's performance metrics began noting, in classified briefings that would not be declassified for another 2 decades, a measurable and unsettling convergence. Conquered crews serving alongside human tacticians were, engagement by engagement, becoming faster to authorize necessary cruelty, slower to hesitate at casualty projections that would have paralyzed the same crews a year earlier, a transformation that several senior Conquered psychologists would later argue in papers that sparked furious and unresolved debate across assembly academic circles for a generation, represented not corruption of Conquered military culture by an alien value system, but the simple, uncomfortable discovery that the doctrine the Conquered had spent 2,000 years believing was morally superior had, in fact, only ever been affordable because the Conquered had never before faced a threat that made its cost explicit. Fleet Marshal Orenthal Kesvantry, supreme commander of remaining Conquered military forces, and a being of the same Threndel species as Kessa Van Orith, watched this campaign unfold over 4 months of increasingly desperate, increasingly grateful correspondence with Admiral Threnathi Vor, and found himself, as the campaign progressed, confronting a specific and uncomfortable truth that the Concord Assembly's closed sessions had begun, in hushed and careful language, to discuss among themselves. Humanity was not merely proving useful in this war. Humanity was winning it, at a cost in civilian lives that the Concord's own strategic doctrine would never have sanctioned. Using tactics that violated every principle of proportionate warfare the Concord had built its 2,000-year military culture around, and doing so with a calm, unhesitating clarity that Fleet Marshal Kesvantry found, if he was honest with himself in the privacy of his own quarters late at night, considerably more frightening than the Threnathi Vor threat itself. Because the Threnathi Vor were an incomprehensible force of nature, and Admiral Vor was not. Admiral Vor was a rational, thoughtful, entirely comprehensible commander who had looked at the mathematics of total war and concluded, without evident struggle, that any cost was acceptable in service of ultimate survival. And a species that could produce such commanders as a matter of ordinary military culture, rather than as an aberration, was a species the Concord Assembly, however grateful for their intervention, would need to think very carefully about how to coexist with once the current emergency had passed. Kesvantry raised this precise concern during a joint staff briefing 5 months into the campaign, aboard his own flagship, the Concord battleship Merciful Accord, in a room full of officers who had spent 2 decades of peacetime service, believing that the doctrine of proportionate, honor-bound engagement was not merely effective but morally correct. A belief that the previous 17 failed engagements against the Threnathi Vor had already badly shaken, and that the human fleet's subsequent successes were now dismantling entirely. "I have reviewed every after-action report from the human-directed engagements," he said, addressing a command staff that included 3 Concord officers who had served, in observer capacities, aboard human vessels during the Ostren Prime bombardment, and had returned changed by the experience in ways their own psychological evaluators had not yet found adequate language to describe. "What troubles me is not that Admiral Vor is willing to order the deaths of civilians. His forces are ostensible. Why protecting? Desperate commanders throughout Concord history have occasionally made such choices, and our own military law has punishment frameworks for precisely that failure of restraint. What troubles me is that Admiral Vor does not appear to regard these decisions as failures of restraint at all. He regards them as correct. And I have watched, across 5 months of correspondence, 3 separate human staff officers independently arrive at the same conclusion he did, using the same cold, unhesitating arithmetic, without any of them requiring his direct order to reach it. This is not one exceptional hardened commander bending under the weight of an impossible war, gentlemen. This is an entire military culture that has been raised for 2 full generations to consider this arithmetic simply and obviously correct. When this war ends, we will not be sending a difficult ally back into peaceful retirement. We will be inviting an entire species that thinks this way into permanent membership among our worlds, and I do not believe this assembly has yet begun to reckon with what that actually means." None of the officers in that room had an answer for him, because none of them, watching the Threnathi Vor advance finally reverse for the first time in 3 years of total war, could bring themselves to argue that the alternative, continued adherence to Concord doctrine, and the 11 billion or more additional deaths that doctrine's continued failure would cost, was the wiser course. It was Kessa Van Orith herself, present at that briefing as the Assembly's senior liaison to the human fleet, who finally spoke into the uncomfortable silence that followed Kesvantry's assessment. "I have spent 5 months aboard the long-memory Fleet Marshal," she said, "and I have watched Admiral Vor's authorized decisions that, if I am honest, cost me sleep for weeks afterward. But I have also watched him personally review casualty projections at 2 in the morning, alone, recalculating strike windows by minutes to save evacuation convoys that his own staff had already written off as unsalvageable, because he refuses to let necessary cruelty become an excuse for careless cruelty. I do not think we are looking at a species without conscience, Fleet Marshal. I think we are looking at a species whose conscience has been forged in a furnace this assembly built for them and then abandoned, and who have concluded, through 51 years of surviving that furnace, that conscience which cannot survive contact with genuine catastrophe is not conscience at all, merely comfort. I do not know if that makes them safer to have as allies or more dangerous. I suspect, Fleet Marshal, it makes them both at once, and I suspect this assembly is going to spend the next century learning to live with that fact rather than resolving it. The war reached its final turning point at the world of Exiled, a heavily populated conquered core system that Threnathi Vor forces reached 14 months into the combined campaign, the closest the enemy had come to the assembly's actual seat of government, and the engagement that would, in the histories eventually written about this war, come to be remembered as the moment humanity's presence in conquered affairs stopped being merely tactically useful and became something the Assembly's surviving member species would spend the following century trying to understand the full implications of. Exiled held a population of 2.3 billion souls, the largest concentration of conquered civilians the Threnathi Vor had yet threatened, and conquered Assembly Council, faced with Torrens' now familiar recommendation of scorched earth denial tactics applied at a scale that would kill an estimated 400 million civilians who could not be evacuated in time, balked for the first time in 14 months of increasingly desperate cooperation. "We cannot authorize this, Admiral," said Assembly Council Chair Ventha Moore-Lashkin, a being of the reptilian Zerath species who had, across 14 months of correspondence, developed something approaching genuine respect for the human commander whose tactics had saved 40-something worlds from total consumption. 400 million civilians is not a cost the Assembly can accept, regardless of the strategic calculus. We are not the Reach, Admiral. We are not a species accustomed to this mathematics, however effectively it has served us thus far. There must be another way." "There isn't," Torrens said, standing before the holographic projection of the full Assembly Council, a body he had addressed perhaps a dozen times across 14 months, and had learned in that time to read with the same flat, patient clarity he had once reserved for reading the moods of a debris field that killed without malice or mercy. "I understand that this is not a mathematics your culture is built to accept, Chair Moore-Lashkin. I understand that 14 months of watch, NG my species make this calculation on your behalf has been, for many of you, a genuinely traumatic education in what total war actually requires. But I am not going to stand here and pretend there is a version of this engagement where 2.3 billion people survive intact, because there is not. The choice in front of this council is not between an acceptable cost and an unacceptable one. It is between 400 million dead in a bombardment that stops the Threnathi Vor advance here, at Exiled, or 2.3 billion dead in 6 weeks when the consumption front reaches this world regardless, because your fleets alone have never once in 17 engagements before we arrived stopped this enemy without our tactics. And I promise you, Chair Moore-Lashkin, 400 million is the smaller number." A delegate from the Vesic Concordant, a species of small, quill-covered beings whose homeworld had been among the first the Threnathi Vor had ever touched, and whose government had lost nearly a fifth of its population before the Assembly formally recognized the threat, spoke into the silence that followed Torrens' answer, her translated voice carrying a bitterness that had clearly been building across 14 months of watching other species debate mathematics her own world had already paid in full. "The Admiral is not asking this council to invent a cruelty that does not already exist in this war, Chair Moore-Lashkin. He is asking us to choose which cruelty we survive. My homeworld did not have the luxury of this debate." The Threnathi Vor arrived, and the Assembly's honorable doctrine debated proportionate response for 11 days while my people died by the millions. And when the debate concluded, the doctrine failed anyway, and we lost the homeworld regardless of how much more slowly and honorably we lost it. I do not relish what the Admiral is proposing. I have buried enough of my own people to relish nothing about this war. But I have also watched, for 14 months, worlds saved that would have been fully consumed under our own doctrine, and I will not vote to return to a mathematics that has already failed my people once, simply because this new mathematics is harder to look at directly. Chair Lashkin absorbed this in the particular stillness of a leader who had spent 14 months learning that every vote in this chamber now carried weight measured in millions of lives rather than abstract policy. And when she finally called the question, her voice carried none of the composed neutrality that Concord parliamentary tradition typically required of a presiding chair. Let the record show that this council does not vote for this measure lightly, and let it show equally that we vote for it because the alternative, however honorable in principle, has been proven, across 17 engagements and uncounted worlds, to cost more lives than it saves. I call the question. The vote that followed was the closest the Assembly Council had come, in 14 months of increasingly desperate cooperation, to refusing a human tactical recommendation entirely. And it passed in the end by a margin of only 6 votes, a margin that Torin understood, watching the projection dissolve after the session concluded, represented something the Concord Assembly would spend the coming century wrestling with. A growing recognition that the species they had exiled 51 years ago for being too dangerous to keep around had, in the crucible of that exile, become exactly dangerous enough to save them. And that saving them had required the Concord to authorize atrocities its own culture would never have sanctioned on its own. Atrocities it now owed, in some uncomfortable and unresolved moral ledger, to the very species it had once sentenced to death. The bombardment of Kersh Aelith's outer agricultural belt proceeded 9 hours after the vote. 400 million civilians dead in a single coordinated strike, and the Threnathi Vor advance, denied the biological substrate it needed to press further into the Concord's core systems, began over the following 3 weeks, the same slow, grinding contraction that had followed every previous application of Torin's brutal doctrine, a contraction that accelerated over the following 7 months. Into a full-scale collapse of the Threnathi Vor's expansion across the entire theater of war, as combined human-conquered forces pressed the advantage with the same unhesitating, unsentimental calculus that had won every engagement since Ostren Prime, driving the enemy's remaining biological mechanical forces back toward the galactic core from which they had originally emerged, until 22 months after Kessa Van Orith's battered scout ship had first limped into the Ashvale Reach carrying a desperate plea from a Concord that had once sentenced humanity to death, the Threnathi Vor threat was declared, in a formal Assembly Council session broadcast to every survive. Zing member world fully contained. Fleet Admiral Torin Akepsoli stood before that final Assembly Council session not as a supplicant, not as an exile seeking readmission to a civilization that had once cast his people out to die, but as the commander whose tactics had saved, by the Concord's own official casualty estimates, an excess of 11 billion civilian lives across the war's 22-month duration. At a cost of just under 6 billion Concord civilians killed by human-directed scorched earth bombardment, and roughly 1.4 million human military personnel killed in direct combat against Threnathi Vor forces, numbers that the Assembly Council's own historians would spend generations arguing over, unable to fully resolve whether the war had been won through humanity's necessary ruthlessness or through an atrocity that the Concord's desperation had simply made itself complicit in. The Assembly Council wishes to formally extend an invitation, said Chair Lashkin, addressing Torin across the same holographic connection that had 14 months earlier carried a vote authorizing the deaths of 400 million of her own people, for humanity to rejoin the Concord Assembly as a full member species, with all rights and protections thereof, and to formally rescind, in full and with public acknowledgement of its injustice, the containment order that exiled your people 51 years ago. Torin stood in the silence that followed this offer for a long moment, looking at the assembled projections of 41-member species, beings who had watched his people bleed and burn their way through a war the Concord's own doctrine had proven catastrophically unable to win. Beings who now offered, in the same breath as their gratitude, the exact readmission to civilized company that had been denied his grandmother's generation on the grounds that humanity was too violent, too unpredictable, too willing to escalate beyond proportionate response to be trusted among the stars. "You were right about us 51 years ago," Torrin said finally, and the words carried across the assembly chamber with a weight that made several of the assembled delegates visibly flinch. "We are too violent. We are too willing to escalate beyond proportionate response. 14 months ago, I stood in a room very much like this one and told your council that 400 million deaths was an acceptable cost. And I meant it. And I would make that same calculation again tomorrow if the mathematics required it. Because that is what 4 decades in a debris field you left us to die in taught my people to become. You did not misjudge humanity 51 years ago, Chair Moore-Lashkin. You judged us accurately, and then you exiled us for the judgment instead of trying to understand what that capacity might mean if it were ever actually needed. We survived your exile by becoming exactly the thing you were afraid of, and now you are asking us to rejoin your civilization not despite that thing, but because of it, because you have finally faced an enemy your own honorable doctrine could not defeat, and discovered that the monster you cast out was the only cure for the monster you couldn't. Is that a refusal, Admiral?" Chair Moore-Lashkin's voice carried genuine uncertainty, the first time in 14 months of correspondence that Torrin had heard the Concord's most senior official sound anything less than composed. "No, Chair Moore-Lashkin. It's an acceptance with a condition. Humanity will rejoin the Concord Assembly. We will take our seat among your 41-member species, and we will bring with us everything the Reach taught us about survival, about cost, about the mathematics of total war that your Concord doctrine has spent 2,000 years pretending it would never need to learn. But we will not pretend, for the comfort of this council or any future one, that we are the same species you exiled 51 years ago, softened and civilized back into whatever shape made us acceptable to you before. We are not asking for readmission on your terms, Chair Moore-Lashkin. We are informing this assembly that we are rejoining on ours, as the species that did what your entire honorable civilization could not. And every member world in this assembly will need to decide, in the years ahead, whether it can live alongside a people who have proven beyond any remaining doubt that they are willing to burn as much of the galaxy as the math requires in order to make certain that something of humanity survives whatever comes next. That is not a threat, Chair Moore-Lashkin. It is simply, at long last, the truth about what your containment order actually created, and I would rather this assembly know that truth clearly than rediscover it, in 20 years or 200, the way you rediscovered us. Desperate at the edge of extinction, and finally willing to ask the monster you made for help. The Assembly Council voted in the hours following. NG that address to formally readmit humanity as a full member species of the Concord, the first unanimous vote in the recorded history of the institution, and the historians who would spend the following century studying the war against the Threnathi Vor and the strange, uneasy peace that followed would note again and again that the vote's unanimity was not born of gratitude alone, but of something closer to fear. 41 species who had watched a people once cast out for being too dangerous return from exile not diminished by 51 years of suffering, but forged by it into the single most effective instrument of total war the galaxy had produced in 2,000 years of recorded history, and who understood, with the particular clarity that comes to civilizations confronting a truth they can no longer avoid, that the greatest danger the Concord Assembly now faced was not the possibility that humanity might one day turn that terrible capacity against them, but the quieter, more unsettling certainty that they would never again be able to face an extinction-level threat without needing to. In the years that followed readmission, the crews who had fought the war against the Threnathi Vor scattered back across the Reach's reclaimed colonies, and increasingly out into the wider Concord Assembly itself, where human veterans found themselves regarded by their new neighbors with a complicated mixture of gratitude, unease, and a specific, wary fascination that never quite resolved into ordinary friendship. Not in that generation and perhaps not in the next. Lieutenant Commander Priya Osaivantal left active service 4 years after the war's end and took a position teaching xenolinguistics at a newly established joint academy on Kersh Aelith itself, on the same world whose outer agricultural belt she had watched burn from the long memory's command deck. And she kept, still, the photograph of the homeworld she had never visited, though she added to it over the years other photographs of students from a dozen conquered species who asked her, sometimes gently and sometimes not, what it had actually been like to grow up in the Reach. And she found that she answered the question differently depending on how much she trusted the person asking, because some truths she had learned were not safe to hand to people who had never needed to survive anything. Commander Yusuf Achterberg de Lacroix remained in fleet service for the rest of his career, rising eventually to command his own dreadnought, and became known throughout the reconstituted Joint Conquered Human Fleet for a particular, exacting insistence on reviewing every casualty projection twice before authorizing a strike, a habit his junior officers initially mistook for excessive caution until they understood. Watching him work through long nights recalculating blast radii by minutes and kilometers to save evacuation convoys other commanders would have written off, that it was not caution at all, but the specific discipline of a man who had learned, under Torrens' command, that the arithmetic of total war did not require abandoning every scrap of mercy, only refusing to let mercy become an excuse for losing, and who intended to carry that discipline forward into whatever wars his children's generation would eventually have to fight. Dr. Amara Osai Kessler published, 6 years after the war's end, a technical analysis of Threnathi Vor consumption biology and the tactical doctrine developed to counter it that became required reading at conquered military academies across 40 member worlds. Though the version taught to conquered cadets was, by careful institutional choice, stripped of the specific casualty figures and the personal testimonies of the officers who had authorized them. A curatorial decision that Dr. Osai Kessler herself objected to in a footnote that several generations of students would find, buried in an appendix, noting that a doctrine taught without its true cost was a doctrine easier to authorize again too quickly, and that the conquered assembly, having finally learned what humanity's mathematics could accomplish, owed it to every future world it might someday need to sacrifice to remember exactly how much that mathematics had already cost. Fleet Marshal Orenthal Kesvantry retired from active command 8 years after the war's conclusion and spent the remainder of his long Threndal lifespan, which would stretch across another 3 centuries, serving on a quiet, largely ceremonial assembly subcommittee charged with the ongoing, deliberately unresolved question of how the Concord's readmitted human members should be integrated into the broader military and diplomatic culture of conquered civilization, a subcommittee whose reports, across those 3 centuries, would return again and again to the same unresolved conclusion Kesvantry had first voiced in that briefing room aboard the Merciful Accord, that humanity's capacity for the mathematics of total sacrifice was not a flaw the conquered could correct through patient integration, was not in the end a flaw at all, but a tool the galaxy now knew it possessed and could never again fully forget it needed, and that the wisest thing any future conquered assembly could do was neither to fear that tool nor to reach for it too quickly, but to hold always the specific memory of what it had cost to forge and what it had cost to use, so that no future generation, human or otherwise, would ever again mistake the mathematics of Ostren Prime or Kersh Aelith for anything other than what it actually was. Not a triumph to be celebrated, but a debt the galaxy had incurred against its own conscience, paid in full by a species it had once tried to leave for dead. Fleet Admiral Torren Ape Solis himself never left the Reach permanently, though he traveled in his later years across a dozen conquered worlds at the Assembly's invitation, delivering testimony to historians and military academies, and on 3 occasions to the Assembly Council itself, always in the same flat, unhurried voice that had carried him through the war, always refusing the honors and monuments that grateful conquered worlds tried repeatedly to build in his name on the grounds. As he told one persistent delegation from Kersh Aelith itself, that a monument built to a man who had ordered the deaths of 400 million civilians was not a monument to victory. It was a monument to a debt, and debts were not meant to be admired. They were meant to be remembered until they were paid, and this one, he suspected, would take longer than his own lifetime to settle. He returned always to Anvil, to the Twilight Terminator where his grandmother had raised him on stories of a world she had never seen, and a containment order she had never stopped resenting. And he died there 31 years after the war's end, in the same modest quarters he had occupied since his first command, having spent every one of those 31 years making certain that the generation of humans growing up in the Reaches now thriving, now fully reconstituted colonies understood exactly what their parents and grandparents had become in order to survive, and exactly what it had cost the wider galaxy to finally need them. His last recorded words, given to a young historian from Kersh Aelith who had traveled to Anvil specifically to ask him whether he had any regrets about the war he had won, were not an apology, and were not, by the historian's own later account, delivered with any visible bitterness. Only the same flat, patient clarity that had carried him through every engagement of the campaign. Regret assumes there was a version of that war I could have fought and still slept easily afterward, he said. There wasn't. I have never once believed the Concord Council had a right to ask my forgiveness for what they did to us in the Reach, and I have never once believed my own people had the right to feel nothing about what we did to win the war they finally needed us for. Both of those things are simply true, and a species that can hold both of them at once, without letting either one excuse the other, is the only kind of species I trust to be handed the mathematics we were handed. Teach your children that arithmetic carefully, historian. Teach them it is not a gift. Teach them it is a debt the whole galaxy is still paying, and hope, for all our sakes, that none of you ever need to spend it again.